welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Need to Read, How Literature's Canon Turns Back Time. Hi everybody, and if you'll just indulge me for a second and my puerile visual sense of humour, I'll explain the thumbnail and the theme of the canon. But for those of you of a certain generation, you remember Cher. And this was the 1989. So I was in my early 20s, libido-drenched postgraduate student. And I vividly remember, this is just a disturbing trip down memory lane, but I remember being in a pub in Edinburgh and this came on, the video jukebox, which was the cutting edge technology of the time. And I wanted to just use it as a intro, a vaguely amusing intro into the concept of the canon, or the Western Canon, as the idea of a traditional, accepted body of literature that's supposed to be worth reading. And as we go along, I'll discuss how that, for some people, is quite a controversial idea, but the theme of this video will be, without the canon, with the loss of traditional literature and a traditional frame of reference, it's not good. I don't think it promises much for society, and I think it also accounts for a lot of the ideological strife that's riven through society at the moment in the Western world. But anyway, on a lighter note, I'm going to make the link between Cher here, in a catchy little number, and Proust, in the sense that Proust's classic, which I'll talk about in a second, In Search of Lost Time, and the pop gurus amongst you, the pop aficionados, will remember the lyrics of Cher's song that she sang on the USS Missouri in 1989, If I Could Turn Back Time. And there you have the extras, so to speak, with the crew of the USS Missouri. It's just a very funny video. I encourage you to check it out. But to be serious for a second, there is this idea of turning back time. I think that's what good literature does. And that's why the canon is important. It's this timeless body of traditional literature that we lose at our peril. And it may be that the counter-argument will be it's a phallocentric patriarchy of white, pale, male, stale writers who've, in some type of Illuminati-type conspiracy, have ensured that they're the only ones that are read. I prefer to think of it more in Darwinian terms. It's survival of the fittest literature that's lasted for centuries, and now it's just increasingly fallen by the wayside, and we can discuss why in a second. But so this was Cher on the USS Missouri, and I promise the disturbing images, well, this type of disturbing image will stop very shortly, but I'm so pedantic, if the more perspicacious amongst you will realise I put the title in a thinner font as some part of recognition of Cher's great artistry. But I've called this picture The Thong in the Throng. I think at one point, not that I've watched this video in any detail, I hasten to add, but she takes a cap off one of the sailors. I think she eventually returns it, but they all go wild. It's just a very funny video, if you ask me. But the concept of the canon, let's get away from Cher. This is Harold Bloom, who was a incredibly well-read literary critic, and he taught at various universities. I'm trying to remember the one he ended up at, he finished his career at, but I think I'd just been making it up, but I thought it was Yale. He did some of the big ones, Yale, Princeton, I think. But he was a major literary critical figure. And these are just two of his. He had a prodigious output. And he edited an awful lot of classic works. So you had a real factory of pumping out. But these are the Western Canon was a collection of what he thought were the best, well, not necessarily the best, but some of the most important pieces of literature that someone who claims to be well read should read. And then he had a massive, completely understandable fixation on Shakespeare. So he wrote this brilliant book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. It's not a small claim, is it? He basically argues that human subjectivity itself was, in the modern sense, only possible through the literature of Shakespeare. But it's a brilliant book. And this idea of, I will talk shortly about the counter-arguments, the concept of, well, the Western canon is, as I've said, pale, stale, white, male. It doesn't have enough diversity of representation, which I fundamentally think is missing the point, because I believe you should concentrate on your own tradition within particular cultures, and from that, if you're not well versed in your own culture, I don't understand how you truly get to understand other cultures. I'd argue it becomes more of a mishmash. You're a jack of all trades, master of none. So I would firmly defend the right to have the concept of a Western canon and not always dilute it with the constant need for diversification, representation, and all what I believe are ideologically driven claims to broaden it out all the time. You risk losing the very thing that it is. But we'll get into this. So, from the Western Canon in 1994, I have tried to confront greatness directly, to ask what makes the author and the works canonical. The answer, more often than not, has turned out to be strangeness, a mode of originality that either cannot be assimilated, or that so assimilates us that we cease to see it as strange. Walter Pater defined romanticism as adding strangeness to beauty, but I think he characterized all canonical writing. I also think you could reverse that and say it's adding beauty to strangeness, but adding strangeness to beauty the same way either way, I suppose. A mode of originality that either cannot be assimilated or that so assimilates us that we cease to see it as strange. But this concept of greatness, I think it links obviously to the point, this is what Bloom's arguing. For something to be canonical, it has to be great. That immediately begs the question, what is great? He also wrote a very large tome called Genius, which explores this in even more depth. But I like this idea of strangeness, because in the mode of always trying to make things more diverse, I'm making an obvious point because many people have observed this anyway, but the idea that in the name of diversity, you actually make things more similar, more homogenous. Everything has the same ideological message. Everyone has to be on board and comfortable, and it's cuddly. And Bloom's point is that it's this uncanniness, the strangeness. So the uncanny in German, I've mentioned in previous videos, is unheimlich, it means unhomely. So one aspect of strangeness is the idea that you recognize it, but it's uncanny because although you recognize it, it still doesn't seem quite right. It seems strange. And I think that's what great art and literature does, from what Bloom is arguing. I totally agree with him. When you read a canonical work for the first time, you encounter a stranger, an uncanny startlement rather than a fulfillment of expectations. What they have in common is their uncanniness, their ability to make you feel strange at home. And the uncanny, unheimlich, is something I really want to look at in future. Freud did an essay on it. There's various authors are fascinated by the concept of the uncanny. So it's not, the uncanny is not just the scary or the totally alarming. The uncanny is more subtle and nuanced. I think it's a fascinating area to think about. So Frank Kermode, Forms of Attention, and he was another great literary critic that Bloom liked, and I think, again, in future, I want to look at more Frank Kermode work. I think he was a wonderful, wonderful critic. He said, canons which negate the distinction between knowledge and opinion, which are instruments of survival built to be time-proof, not reason-proof, are of course deconstructible. If people think there should not be such things, they may very well find the means to destroy them. Their defence, in other words, canon's defence, cannot any longer be undertaken by central institutional power. They cannot any longer be compulsory, though it is hard to see how the normal operation of learned institutions, including recruitment, can manage without them. Now, this was 1985, as you can see, and what alarms me is what he was warning of, or what he was suggesting, that without the canon, we won't manage without them. I do think that is part of the reason we are living in such divided times. And for coming from the university sector, any idea of the canon was ideologically suspect. And it just became a mishmash of, just to repeat, this constant drive for so-called diversity and the inclusion of underrepresented groups, etc. So that automatically undermines the notion of the canon. But it's all right saying all these quite large claims, but one thing to think about is, or one specific aspect of the canon, and I go back to the half joke but half serious point about Cher and Proust, the concept of time, the way in which works from the canon have, I would argue, have a special relationship to time. And today, without the canon, we live in this eternal now that's prefigured, as I'll talk about later in this talk, about the eternal now. It's quite surreal and absurd living in a 24/7 media-saturated society, but hints of that are provided by people like Samuel Beckett and his plays. The literature of the absurd, I would suggest, prefigured and foresaw when traditional religion is gone, when traditional canon of literature is gone. You're trapped in this eternal now. And for Beckett, it was a very Burr stage, as we'll see in plays like Waiting for Godot. Just because we're all now trapped in this 24/7 media-saturated, image-driven flood, tsunami of images. So it's not like this Burr stage of Waiting for Godot. I think existentially, just being alone, adrift in this sea of images, is just the mirror image, the opposite extreme of what Beckett portrays. So to look at this concept, now this is, I'm trying to get the pronunciation right, he was a Romanian writer, Mircea Eliade. Apologies to any Romanian speakers. This whole talk will involve Russian mispronunciations. I've just done a Romanian, so I will do my level best, but I'm hopeless. I have a very bad ear for languages. I read, obviously, but my hearing for languages, my sense of tone is atrocious. But he distinguishes profane time and sacred time. So this book, The Sacred and the Profane, which is well worth a look. Profane time, ordinary temporal duration in which acts without religious meaning have their setting. So profane time, we've largely, as a society, got rid of religion. I understand people are religious, but as a social value, it's been marginalised, whereas it used to be central to everything societies did in the West. So profane time is without religion. Sacred time, a primordial mythical time made present. And this is key. A primordial mythical time made present. And Eliade, he had this concept of the terror of history, which I'll give you a quote about in a second. But the terror of history is just being alone again in the sea of time when events just happen to humankind, whereas mythical time, the time contained in traditional literature, is repetitive and cyclical, and it psychologically helps to anchor people cultures and individuals. So when you get rid of the canon, if you follow Eliada's point of view, then what you've left with is you're just adrift in profane time. Whereas primordial mythical time is psychologically a just much more comfortable, recognizable place to be. So he develops this idea: non-religious man descends from religious man, and whether he likes it or not, he is also the work of religious man. His formation begins with situations assumed by his ancestors. Non-religious man has been formed by opposing his predecessor, by attempting to empty himself of all religion. To acquire a world of his own, he has desacralized the world in which his ancestors lived. But to do so, he has been obliged to adopt the opposite of an earlier type of behaviour, and that behaviour is still emotionally present to him, in one form or another, ready to be reactualised in his deepest being. The irreligious still behave religiously, even though they are not aware of the fact. So I just love this idea in Eliada, the concept that even the most overtly non-religious, there are vestiges in our culture, there's a need for, if not believing in all the tenets of religion, this point about having some type of point of contact with mythical time, and to be adrift without any central source of meaning. So I think even Richard Dawkins, just a card-carrying, raging fundamentalist atheist, has argued that he's a cultural Christian, because he recognises the importance, the orientation that culture provides. So this is another book he did. I love this concept of the subtitle, The Myth of the Eternal Return. And this beautiful phrase, the terror of history. How can the terror of history be tolerated from the viewpoint of historicism? In other words, that everything is just history and a series of events that humans create and suffer from themselves. Justification of a historical event by the simple fact that it is a historical event. In other words, by the simple fact that it happened that way, will not go far toward freeing humanity from the terror that the event inspires. So you can think of the French Revolution, they actually called it the terror of the political violence that stemmed from it. That would be a classic example of events getting out of control. And there's the stock phrase, revolutions have a tendency to eat their own children. But this beautiful idea, the terror of history. And opposed to that, this is what I'm going to argue all the way through, is the concept of the circularity. So regular viewers of this channel will be fed up to the back teeth of seeing Caravaggio's Narcissus painting. But this is on the... I'm going to talk as we go along about book cover designs. Ovid's Metamorphoses, you can see they are... In a previous video a long time ago, I showed the Ouroboros, the mythical snake eating its own tail image. And that is a description of the tails within. Deliberate pun there. The tails within Ovid's Metamorphoses. They're like snake tails. They're tails within tails. They're labyrinthine, they're serpentine. And if anyone wants to get into Ovid's Metamorphoses, I really do recommend, I obviously recognise it, I bought it, but I recommend this edition. It's quite a nice translation. And I'm going to talk about translation in a second, but it is funny because there are various editions. I've got the whole Metamorphoses in Latin. Then I've got a literal translation from the Latin, and then there are just numerous different translations. And you can be overwhelmed by the fact that if you're not a Latin scholar, which I definitely am not, the endless complexity of trying to translate, never mind Latin, from any language into another language. But my advice is just embrace it, find it, lose yourself in the complexity rather than getting stressed out by it. But just little word choices. But even if you're not a Latin scholar, if you've got the original and you've got literal translations. You can see how it's been interpreted when you then look at more liberal translations that have been designed to be more readable. And the whole process is just fascinating to see how language works like that. But this is talking about translation. This is a beautiful, it's complicated and it's deep. If you're looking for a casual read, I do not recommend this. But if you're really into the question of language and translation, as the subtitle would imply, it's a brilliant, brilliant book. And what Steiner does, I love lots of his work, and he's a great author to illustrate the points I'm making, because a lot of his work is about, there's one book about the masters. He basically often addresses the concept of the canon in various ways. But in this particular book, he's talking about just the difficulty, not just of translating from one language to another, that should be obvious to most people, but the difficulty of translating from one time to another. So we're back to this theme of time. And he does some beautiful examinations of romantic poetry, Coleridge and people, and Shakespeare, and points out that within Shakespeare's own time, he was ahead of the curve with the use of various pieces of language, and then certain key concepts that Shakespeare used obviously evolved over time, and they mean something completely different to modern people. So it's both the beauty and the drawback of literature that you're not reading anything like what Shakespeare intended for his own audience, and you can see that as a problem or a boon, because that it's like a palimpsest. It's like a document that's been written on and then rubbed out, and you can see traces of what was rubbed out because something new is written on the manuscript. And that is a metaphor for how literature works, and Steiner is brilliant at explaining it. And what's great about it is he explains the overwhelming complexity, and he's basically advocating what I just suggested, this notion of just embrace it. Don't get overwhelmed by it. Just admire it, the beauty of the complexity. And that stands in, I've put the subtitle there, diversity and representation. What frustrates me about the whole drive, you can't or you shouldn't just have the Western canon. You need to introduce all these other ethnicities and so on to be more represented. Steiner, he doesn't address, from memory, I don't think he addresses that point at all. That's not what his book's about. But my point I'm trying to emphasize is within his book, he's showing the difficulty within a single relatively homogenous culture, Western Christian culture, the difficulty of passing down knowledge from one generation to another within that culture, never mind across it. So if you're always seeking to diversify your own culture by bringing in what I would sometimes label virtue signaling amounts and quotas of other representations, it's difficult enough to understand your own culture. You're just muddying the waters more and more and more by this insistence upon so-called representation. And it's got to the extent I had a very nice, just to give you a very specific example, I encountered it all the time at the universities, but I had a very nice, I think it was a young woman of colour on the channel who, it was a throwaway comment. We were just discussing something very politely, and she made the comment that she hadn't engaged with Greek classic literature like the Iliad because there were problems of representation. And I figured, I didn't immediately understand what she meant, and I figured out, because the Iliad or the Odyssey doesn't have any black people, there's a problem of representation. I just find that bewildering. If I was reading Nigerian literature, I wouldn't expect lots and lots of information on white people. I know very, very little about Chinese literature. I really wouldn't be offended if I read Chinese classic and there were no mention of white people. It's a bizarre, I just find it a bizarre mindset. So I'm in complete and utter defense of the particularity of individual cultures. But to move on, because I just sometimes think you're flogging a dead horse because people are so drenched in this ideology of diversity. But if you want to look at the underlying complexity, so the idea that any single culture is monolithic and homogeneous and stale and pale, all these accusations that are made. Steiner provides this brilliant account of the genuine diversity within cultures. And just to reiterate and just leave it on this, because I'll just go on and on about it, but the concept that within a culture there is genuine diversity if you learn to understand your own culture. And you're never going to do that if you're constantly appealing to quotas of diversity. And I now want to broaden the thing out about the concept of translation. And I'm going to start, I've already been doing it, but what I want to do is start, people have asked on the channel for book recommendations, and I was wondering how to do it. So increasingly in future videos, I'm going to start mentioning books that I recommend. But before I do that, this concept of translation, just to finish it off. So as you can see, Le Tombeau de Marot was the poem this refers to. This is the name of a poem. Oh, sorry. This is the name of Hofstadter's book, but it's based upon, it's not the title of the poem. There was a poem written in 1537 by Clement Marot, who, he's not a famous poet particularly, but Hofstadter takes this poem, and it was 28 lines, I think, and he sent it to a load of his friends around the world and asked them to translate it. And the whole book is about just the almost infinite number of ways a relatively minor poem can be translated. So the subtitle there, in praise of the music of language. And the music of language is cleverly exhibited in the very title, because le tombeau in French is the beautiful tone or the sweet tone. Whereas le tombeau, it's a homophone. It's exactly the same sound to a French speaker. I've probably mangled it, so there is a distinction. But that means the tomb or the grave. So immediately you've got this nuance within the language, as I'm pointing out, within a specific, relatively homogeneous language, there is this innate diversity of interpretation. I think the original poem was Une Demoiselle Malade. It's to a sick, it was young lady. And I think it was a 7 or 8 year old girl he was writing it for. Marot was writing it for Jean d'Albret de Navarre. But it's, if you want to check this out, Hofstadter's more better known for, I think he wrote a book about Gogol and physics, and highly imaginative writer about complex physics issues. And this is a slightly unusual book that he did about language. So, diving now into, if you're going to talk about the canon, what are the books that I'd recommend? And I'm not going to just now go through recommending individual books, but I want to develop this concept of time. So this is my way of loose associations, talking about time. And if nothing else, there are many reasons to read the Western Canon, but if for no other reason, I thought one way of keeping it relatively a unified theme on this particular video would be this concept of time, Cher and Proust. So we've looked at Cher more than we should have. Now Proust. And I think it's sometimes underplayed the significance of the particular edition of a book that you get. But if you can, if they're not cheap, I think in pounds sterling, they're about 20. Paperback of this is about £24, and there are 6 volumes, and the last 3 volumes I don't think are in paperback yet. So there are other editions, but just to, and I have no links with, this is Yale University Press, I have no links with them, and I have no links with the author whatsoever. But it's a large format, very big margins, and the notes are to the side of the page that you're reading, so you don't have to constantly go to the back of the book. It's really well annotated. It's an edited version of the best translation. I just think it's really good. And on the front, the whole theme of In Search of Lost Time. So the 6 volumes, the way it's constructed in this edition, and Swan's Way is the first volume. But the overall title of the novel, obviously, is In Search of Lost Time. And the Madeleine, this is the eternal huge debate in French culture. Is that a biscuit? Is it a cake? But that's a madeleine, and it's shaped like a scallop, which is about the pilgrims of Saint Jacques. It's this the symbolism all the way through. But this particular food item, Marcel, the narrator, when he bites on one of these, as an adult, he gets transported back to his childhood. And it's all about involuntary memory and the concept of time, the way in which the whole it's I'm going to have to work out a way to do this on the channel, but it's like I said, 6 volumes. It's a huge, big book. And one of because I've been encouraging people to read it, but then I feel guilty because, to be honest, you really have to read the 6 volumes to get the full effect. And then the question is, who has time to read just over 2,000 pages? But then I get defensive about that because people go to the gym for X hours per week, and if you add the time it takes to travel to the gym on top of the time to get all sweaty, you talk. I don't know, because I never go to the gym, obviously, but you are talking hours and hours a week. And my argument would be, if you read an hour a day of Proust, depending on your reading speed, obviously, but you could finish it in a month or two. It's not this lifelong commitment that people would make you believe it is. But the reason for me advocating you do read the whole thing is that it's this sweeping panoramic view of this guy's life, the way he goes back in time. And I was saying in the comment section to somebody, it's a bit like test match cricket. For those of you that hate cricket, especially test match cricket, for those of you who don't know, cricket has been evolved in recent years. It's more and more short form. Like, there's 100 balls you have to face in one iteration of the game. There's 50 over cricket, which is 300 balls per innings, and so on and so on. Whereas a test match lasts 5 days. Often there isn't a result. It can be a draw. It's become more exciting in recent decades, but when I grew up watching it, it truly was. It was like Samuel Beckett in white flannels. It was incredibly slow. But I'm a defender of this weird phenomenon of boredom is I think there's an aesthetic of boredom. I think boredom is a much underappreciated element of psychological development. And it's interesting that young kids in contemporary society are not exposed to boredom much, as far as I can see, because of the constant online stimulation. Whereas I remember huge swathes of my childhood just being like physically bored to the point that it was almost tangible. And it's hard to explain, but I do think that has a productive psychological effect. I think your brain recharges in the thrall of complete and utter boredom. You actually generate a bit of self-reliance. You have odd thoughts, all the things you don't have time for if you're constantly stimulated, and there's always a fresh dopamine hit of the last latest social media message. But anyway, it's an epic book, and there are slow bits. And I've said to loads of people, you just need to let the slow bits wash over you. And if you're reading the 30th page of just some banal incident that the narrator Marcel's describing, and you're asking yourself, why am I doing this? The reason is that there is no pace to it. There is no car chase. It's about getting as deep into someone's recollections and psychological mind state as is possible. And then, because the effect of the overall book is all about context, the long, relatively boring bits, when something happens, the artistic effect is amazing. But you have to suffer. So in a test match, when a wicket goes down, because you've been sat on the sofa for 3 hours with your eyes glazing over, it makes the loss of a wicket much more exciting. It's just a different aesthetic. It's hard to explain. To American audiences, baseball's about as close as it gets. but then you're just constantly having hot dogs and standing up. What was it, the seventh inning stretch or whatever? Apologies if I misremembered. But anyway, no, baseball, bad cricket. It's like they have gloves, they're just cheating, all the fielders. It's rubbish. But anyway. But just to give you an example of a very specific, because as always, I like to mix the art and the narration, the literature. This is a view of Delft by Vermeer, and they estimate it was 1659 to 1660. So if you can have a good look at it. And this is closer up. And then one further delve into the depths of the painting. And I'm showing you this because in volume 5 of In Search of Lost Time, which is called The Captive, I'm reading from a book called Paintings in Proust, a visual companion to In Search of Lost Time by a guy called Eric Corpeles, or Karpeles, Corpeles, I'm assuming Corpels. And what he does is he goes through the whole of In Search of Lost Time, all 6 volumes, and shows the artwork that is referred to in the book. And in volume 5, The Captive, this is how he sets it up. He describes how this is the Carpella's. The news of the death of the novelist Bergot, who is one of the characters, a friend of an elderly mentor to Marcel. So news of the death of the novelist Bergot reaches the narrator. The writer had stopped paying calls and rarely left his own home, living quietly and simply. However, Bergot was roused to have a last look at a much-loved painting and rallied his strength to go to the exhibition. So that's the setup. And this is the actual quote from In Search of Lost Time, Volume 5. So this writer has gone to see, he's very ill, but he can't resist the temptation to leave his house or his apartment and go and see the Vermeer that's being exhibited. The circumstances of his death were as follows. A fairly mild attack of uremia had led to his being ordered to rest. But an art critic, having written somewhere that in Vermeer's view of Delft, lent by the gallery at the Hague for an exhibition of Dutch painting, a picture which he adored and imagined that he knew by heart, a little patch of yellow wall, which he could not remember, was so well painted that it was, if one looked at it by itself, like some priceless specimen of Chinese art, of a beauty that was sufficient in itself. Bergot ate a few potatoes, left the house, and went to the exhibition. At the first few steps he had to climb, he was overcome by an attack of dizziness. He walked past several pictures and was struck by the aridity and pointlessness of such an artificial kind of art, which was greatly inferior to the sunshine of a windswept Venetian palazzo or of an ordinary house at the sea. At last he came to the Vermeer, which he remembered as more striking, more different from anything else he knew, but in which, thanks to the critic's article, he noticed for the first time some small figures in blue, that the sand was pink, and finally the precious substance of the tiny patch of yellow wall. His dizziness increased. He fixed his gaze, like a child upon a yellow butterfly that it wants to catch, on the precious little patch of wall. That's how I ought to have written, he said. My last books are too dry. I ought to have gone over them with a few layers of colour, made my language precious in itself, like this little patch of yellow wall. Meanwhile, he was not unconscious of the gravity of his condition. In a celestial pair of scales there appeared to him, weighing down one of the pans, his own life, while the other contained the little patch of wall so beautifully painted in yellow. He felt that he had rashly sacrificed the former for the latter. He repeated to himself, little patch of yellow wall with a sloping roof, little patch of yellow wall. And this is, just to give you an example, and this is purely subjective, but this is a still life with teapot and fruit by Henri Rousseau from circa 1910. And just to, again, that little patch of yellow wall that's referred to in Proust, my version of that is the green in this painting. And in the previous video, I talked about the green of the jungle in Henri Rousseau paintings. And I'm just always constantly, I go back to this because it's such a bland topic, a teapot with fruit. But there's something about that green. And I'm going to ruin it now, but did you get that earworm of the Kermit the Frog song? It's not easy being green. But that greenness, and that's what I would suggest that Proust does so brilliantly. That painting is timeless. There is nothing going on in it. It is the archetype of a still life. It's the complete opposite and anathema to the 24/7 media saturated image world. And that's why I just can't stop banging on about In Search of Lost Time, because it's the written equivalent of this, and that's why I think throughout the book Proust refers to so many artists. And it sounds just basically being as mad as a box of frogs, appropriately enough for the colour, but mad as a box of frogs, we're talking about how a colour could have that effect or could make you. So if I ever get locked up, which is quite a distinct possibility for anything I've said in the UK at the moment, I would just close my eyes, and this is the type of image I'd have to see me through, eating prison food and sharing a cell with a guy called Bubba. But quickly moving on from my fevered imagination. Again, I'm just thinking of, forgive me, this says The Go-Between, a new musical. God help us. But I'm showing you the image because it's a brilliant depiction, the image. The idea of turning L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, which is a brilliant, it's just such a glorious novel about the nostalgia of childhood and lost innocence. It's elegiac, it's gorgeous. So what do they what does the Jedlicka Performing Arts Centre have to do? Turn it into a bloody musical. But forget all that, please. Just concentrate on the image. It's this little boy. It's a beautiful novel about one hot summer, which is incredibly rare in the UK. But there's a drought, and he's staying at a friend's house, and the outfit he's got on is thick material, so it's completely inappropriate. And so he doesn't fit in. His friend is much, much wealthier than he is. So there's that poignancy that he's out of his depth. And it's a tale of lost innocence, but it's timeless in the sense it conveys the summer holiday of a young person. And if you can think back to when you were young, excuse me, and at the beginning of a summer holiday, the 6 weeks or whatever it was that you had off school would seem like an eternity. I can spend 6 weeks nowadays just wandering around the kitchen trying to remember what I was looking for. But when you're younger, time has a different feeling, and it's this theme of time, but the go-between is so beautifully elegiac about the timelessness of the childhood experience. It's absolutely brilliant. And it's the opening line, one of my favourite opening lines of any novel ever, is "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Which I just think is stunning. And talking about stunning, you're now going to have to put up with me raging on enthusiastically about Russian literature. And I just wanted to use this as an excuse just to show some maybe lesser known to Western audiences, some Russian and Ukrainian artists. So this is called Vladimirka. And I have to apologize. I'm going to do my best to pronounce the Russian titles. But it's by a guy called Isaac Levitan. And one of the reasons I love it's, I'm going to try and explain why I love Russian literature so much. Because in preparation for this talk, I was reading Oblomov, which I'm going to do a whole video on before I do the promised videos on Brothers Karamazov and In Search of Lost Time. And when I was at university in Edinburgh, it was a 4-year degree. And in the second year, you could do a whole year outside course, like something not devoted to your main topic of study. And I did 19th century Russian studies. Half the course was literature, half the course was history. And it lasted a year. And I honestly, it was the happiest studying time of my life. It was amazing. So when I was reading Oblomov and Russian literature just over the last few days, I was walking around the house with this stupid grin on my face. I'd just forgotten, and I don't know, I'm sharing with you now too much probably, but I don't know why I love Russian literature so much. I think I have never done regression therapy. I don't believe in reincarnation, but if I did, I think I must have been some Russian babushka in the early 1800s. Because there's something about the Russian, not even sense of humor, because it's just dark. And my favourite anecdote, I don't know how true this was, but everyone should be familiar with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the TV series. Apparently in the Russian version, they had to stop the ask the audience option because the Russian audiences kept giving the wrong answers deliberately. which is just my sense of humour. I just think... Anyway, I'm wittering, but there's something about the Russian... And part of the Russian literature that I love is that on the one hand, 19th century Russian literature's... It's almost self-enclosed because the Emancipation Reform Act of 1861, it was Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs. But for the most of the early 1800s, there was this sense that change needed to happen, and eventually it did. And obviously, in the early 1900s, you had the Russian Revolution. But you've got this static, the scale of the country, just as far as the eye can see. Just a bit of a closer up view. And then it's the role of the Orthodox Church. So this is like a roadside shrine, and there's a church in the background. And some of the art of the time. So this is still Isaac Levitan, Golden Autumn, 1895. If you wanted, a definition of what autumn should look like, it doesn't get more autumny than that. And then we're back to my obsession with green. And the Henri Rousseau type greenness of dense foliage. This is called By the Whirlpool from 1892. And then the modernness of some of it. So this is Levitan from Haymaking, it was called, from 1900. But just the Rothko-like strips of paint. And then this is Morning in the Dnieper. Hope I pronounced that right. Arkhip Ivanovich Kuyindi. Say that again. Kuyinzi. So it's Arkhip Ivanovich Kuyinzi. Kuyinji. Just give up now. But again, just the vastness. And this is Evening in Ukraine by Konstantin Krzyzewski from 1901. And I'll explain why I'm showing you all these, because I'm going to look at some Russian book covers shortly. But just to give the atmosphere of the peasant life in the Ukraine-Russia area. Just think incredibly atmospheric, the dying light of the day. And then this was all just a lead up to start to talk about, as an example of the Western Canon, why I think Russian literature is so important. So Dead Souls, Nikolai Gogol. I like Gogol, and so I think someone mentioned him in the comments. He did some very funny, long short stories, novella type things, but Dead Souls was a full-length novel, and it's about a guy called Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov. And his scam is that he goes around serfs who had died yet hadn't been recognised. Their death hadn't been formally, officially recognised because there was a periodic government census. So while they were dead but not recognised as dead, landowners would still pay tax. So what this Chichikov did was go around in the novel and offer to buy these dead souls so that he could then have the documentation and use that to get collateral. He'd use that as collateral to get loans. So it was a big financial scam, and these people, all the people he goes to visit, are obviously very suspicious. Why would you want to buy my dead servants? And it's a caricature and a parody and a satire on the stupid Russian bureaucracy of the time. This particular, the New York Review books, I think the publisher's called them. They're very nice copies if you're interested. In general, I've had New York Review books. It's a really nice publisher, really good quality books. But this is the original painting. So it's Pavel Fedotov from 1847, and the title of the painting is Just Knighted, Mourning of the Official Who Received His First Cross. So he's receiving this bureaucratic bauble. That's a brilliant. He's got little twisty things in his hair. Obviously, I think he's curling it. But then this is my favourite book cover. And it's one of the interesting things is that there are very good translations now. So I think they're called Alma Classics, have started retranslating a lot of these classics. And it's a brilliant publishing house. But they have like relatively abstract, non-painting book covers. And I just think there's a beautiful symmetry of a classic book with a classic piece of art. So this is the front cover of the Old Penguin Classic. And this is just in more detail. And the original was called Religious Procession in Kursk Province by Ilya Rypin. So I believe it's pronounced Rypin. It's Repin. But I think it's a stunning painting. And later, this was 1883, but later he was much admired because he's showing how the peasants were being mistreated largely. And I think Stalin became, or was a fan of his work, which isn't much of a recommendation, is it? But this is, I'd argue, the main character of the painting. Is a little hunchback boy. And notice that you don't know who the person next to him is. It could be his father or some type of guardian. But the way in which the stick separates him from, if you look to the right, there's a very smug-looking woman holding the icon in the procession. She looks, I'll show her face closer up in a second, she looks smug, whereas the boy, the disabled boy, is intent and earnest, and it's the difference in the pretentiousness and genuine religious belief, arguably. So there's a brilliant portrayal of smugness, the fat-faced, so-called important people of the village, the potentates. And that's another aspect of the religious procession. You can see someone in the crowd being whipped by the guy on the horse. And just the portrayal of the way in which authority, the peasants are dominated by authority. And I just think it's fascinating because this is what an artist is sensing before the Russian Revolution actually took place. Obviously, tensions were high. And then you've got the women with the empty case. So the smug-looking woman is carrying the icon, and this is the empty case, but they're much more humble women. So it's a beautiful painting about pretentiousness versus humility and genuineness and sincerity. And my favourite bit from the whole painting is this. The hair-obsessed priest. Is my hair okay? And then Ripon says this: to descend for 1 minute into this darkness and to say, I am with you, is hypocrisy. To wallow with them forever is a senseless sacrifice. To elevate them to one's own level, to give life, this is a heroic deed. So the painting is called The Hunchback Study from 1881. It was a couple of years earlier than the painting you've just seen. But this is Ripon talking about the peasants and how they should be represented. And I'd argue it could be applied to Tolstoy, who was a bit of a do-gooder. And this is Ripon's portrayal of Tolstoy in 1883. And on another occasion, I'll go into a load of detail about Tolstoy. But he tried to basically have a model estate where he treated the peasants much, much better than they had been. And I must admit, he's not, I think, to say he's overrated would be, who am I to say that? But he's not the favourite Russian writer, that's for sure. But Anna Karenina, this has been used as the cover on quite a few editions. And this particular painting's by Ivan Kramskoy. It's called Stranger from 1883. And Anna Karenina, the novel, was from 1878. And it's, again, I probably prefer it to War and Peace quite significantly for reasons I'll go into on another occasion. But it has the great opening line: all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Which again is why I just love Russian sensibility. All happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Now let me spend the next 800 pages exploring this unhappiness. And then next I'm going to show you one of my, and this shows you, like I say, my dark Russian sensibility. This is Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan on November the 16th, 1581. That is the whole title. Again, by Ripin, 1883 to 1885, they estimate. I am conscious as I'm showing these, some of these authors will be part of modern Ukraine, so it's just a huge, complicated mess. But if you think of them, if I lazily use the term Russian, it's of the time. I think the Russian literature is just a very broad catch-all term, so I don't want to be accused by anyone of misrepresenting the nationality of anyone. I think it's stunning. The painting depicts Ivan the Terrible has this fit of anger, and he lashes out and kills his son, and then realizes what he's done. And then Lermontov is a hero of our times, one of the first Russian literature books I ever read. And if you've got a teenager who you're trying to introduce to Russian literature, this would be perfect, because he's a disaffected, too cool for school, bored cavalry officer who goes to the Caucasus and puts himself in danger all the time because he has a death wish. And it's very existentialist before existentialism was a thing. And I just find it interesting. This is the modern version. They're trying to make it more appealing. And by the way, the modern library, this edition, they are beautiful. I really, really like their copies, paperback copies. So if you ever see any modern library books, I recommend go for them. This is again Ripien, the portrait of Velosivol. Oh, I was able to say this before. Velosvolod Gashin. Vesvolod. That would be my best effort. Vesvolod Gashin. Who was a tragic character. I think I've mentioned him in a previous video. I think he very sadly took his own life through various, he had mental illness, mental health problems. And he wrote truly depressing short stories. But he's used, I mention him because he's used on the front of one of my favourite books of all time, Oblomov. And I don't think it's an appropriate cover in the sense that in real life that writer was quite active, whereas Oblomov is very lazy. And I think in Japan, is it called hikikomori, are shut-ins that don't go anywhere. And this would describe Oblomov. So in English, the phrase used is Oblomovism. It's basically you never leave the house and you're filled with inertia. So it was basically huge swathes of Western society during lockdown. And I think the literal transliteration that's used in the recent translation of Oblomov is Oblomovshchina, which I think is a great phrase for if you're feeling lazy. And it's just a very funny book. So he has a servant called Zakhar who has huge sideburns and has weird idiosyncratic behavior. So when he calls him, he's very grumpy. He lives on top of a big stove to keep warm. And when he comes to see his master Oblomov, if he's in a bad mood, he stands at right angles and just looks sideways at him. And it's just very funny the way it's described. And it was Peggy Guggenheim, I think, in her biography, her autobiography, her memoirs. She had Samuel Beckett as a lover once, and she referred to him as Oblomov because he was so inertial. And apparently Samuel Beckett signed some of his letters later on in life as Oblomov. And I'd argue there are hints of Oblomov and Zakhar in Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. I do think there's some similarities. But the next is a brilliant quote which sums up Oblomov. Now or never, to be or not to be. Oblomov raised himself from his chair a little, but failing to find his slippers with his feet at once, sat down again. And the whole book's like that. He's about to do something and then he never does. So this is one of the examples. In the small confines of the Gorokhovaya flat, almost all activities, save those absolutely essential to maintain life, have ceased. Dust becomes an emblem of the stagnation that has settled upon Oblomov's tiny realm. It is everywhere, on the heavy and graceless mahogany furniture, on the carpets, the walls, around the several pictures. Thick layers have coated the yellowed pages of books left open at the point in the past when reading stopped, and lie upon newspapers bearing the dates of other years. So remember the theme of the talk, this timelessness. It's the time itself seems to have come to a standstill in the Gorokhovaya apartment. The dust has coated the apartment's windows, and Oblomov relies upon occasional visitors, not only for news of the outside world, but even to ascertain the time of year. Don't come near, don't come near, you are from the cold, he cries out to each of his successive guests, only to be told that it is a beautiful May 1st, and that the sun is warm. This is I'm pretty sure this is from, I've got my quotes mixed up. This is from an essay about Oblomov. I just love the time itself seems to have come to a standstill. Like I said, I find this haunting, but I'm not sure it's the best example of Oblomov's personality. But to make the link with Samuel Beckett, I love the sparseness, the burness. You can see the emptiness of the stage, and there's that one tree. And this is Beckett with the artist Alberto Giacometti, who designed the tree that's used. This was them in Giacometti's studio. I just think the sparseness, the way, but again, this point about timelessness. It's the emptiness of the stage. There's no activity. The waiting for Godot dialogue, it's going nowhere. Nothing ever happens. It's waiting, waiting. This is an artwork by Giacometti called Piazza from 1947 to 8. And then this was Walking Man 1. And you can hopefully see why Beckett and Giacometti worked together. This is Walking Man 1 from 1960. And this is one of his artworks. And I think, so Giacometti oft had this tendency to do stick people, but also trees in a very rough outline, very thin outline. And I'm pretty sure I read in a biography of Beckett that there were larch trees where Beckett came from quite a nice middle-class household. And on the land outside is where he grew up. There were larch trees. So maybe that accounts for his links with Giacometti. But again, to this point about timelessness. This morning when I awoke, I saw my towel as if for the first time, that weightless towel in a stillness never seen before, and as if suspended in a dreadful silence. It no longer had any connection to the chair without bottom or to the table whose legs no longer quite rested on the floor, barely touched it. There was no longer any connection among objects separated by the incommensurable chasms of the void. And that was from Le Rêve, Le Sphinx et la Mort d'été. But as if suspended in a dreadful silence, it no longer had any connection to the chair. The incommensurable chasms of the void. Again, it's this timelessness. And then another definite future video will be Krapp's last tape. And I just think it's incredibly prescient. So from 1958, it's basically a one-act monologue where Krapp plays back tapes that he recorded when he was younger, and he obsessively goes back. But it's a metaphor for how you can't go back. You're a different person. As Heraclitus said, you can never step in the same river twice. The point being the river keeps flowing and is different all the time. And it just reminds me of people, whenever you see people in public nowadays, everyone's filming everyone on their mobile phone. In protests, on either side of a protest, people are holding up mobile phones and filming the other person like some weird crucifix against a vampire. It's I don't quite understand, some like magic amulet. If you hold your mobile phone up, everything, and you record everything will be all right somehow. I find it very odd. But it's, like I say, really prescient account of people trying to obsessively record every aspect of their life and then go back. And Proust's whole book, to take this back to the beginning, Proust's whole book is about trying to do that in an organic, literary way. And Krapp is doing it in a forced, trying to capture the very thing that can't be captured, the evanescence of memory and life. And these are some of the famous actors. So what you just saw was John Hurt. He's on the far right. And I think there's YouTube videos of some of this you might be able to find. But on the left is Harold Pinter. Then there was Barry McGovern. And during Krapp's last tape, these are all people who've played the role. Barry McGovern eating the banana. Krapp keeps eating bananas he's got stashed away all around his very scruffy, untidy room. It's just a really I encourage you to try and see if you can find online any old various actors have played the role. But personally, I think the best of all of them, the most atmospheric, is John Hurt. But this, like I say, the inability to capture time. And just to end on the note, I think what the Western canon, what I've tried to suggest the Western canon is able to do, Eliade was arguing the same, like the quotes I gave about sacred and profane time. It's what happens when you lose touch with traditional time and you give yourself over to precisely measured chronological time. And here you have crap trying to go back to things he said in the past and relive that moment that's just unobtainable. And in the absence of the canon to secure and orientate ourselves, to make the strange beautiful, to use that quote, if the strange isn't beautiful, if the uncanny isn't made beautiful through the canon and literature and art that I've been showing you, then you're left with the terror of history that Eliade talks about. And I'll just leave you with one last image of what that terror of history without the canon might look like. So until the next time, all the very best.